Welcome, everybody. It is wonderful to have you join with us. Um, I'm just really excited to be able to spend this time with you and with our special guest. Rabbi Matthew Gewirtz will be with us in just a moment. As you know, this evening, or as you might know, this evening begins the holiday of Purim. And so we thought this would be a beautiful way to lead in to the holiday because we get a chance to think about what makes our lives meaningful and how we can find a sense of purpose in our life. And we're joined with someone who can really help us towards that in a surprising and I think beautiful and inspired way. But Rabbi Gewirtz will be joining us in just a few minutes. For those of you who might be new to Book of Life, we're three colleagues and friends, Rabbi Sidney Mintz, myself, and Rabbi Matthew Gewirtz, who have spent now, boy, Sidney, it's been a little over a year since we first started talking about this. It was right before the pandemic was upon us, and we didn't imagine that this would evolve in this platform, but it has for obvious reasons. And we've had an opportunity to spend a great deal of time studying with one another and really reflecting on what is it we want to be writing in our book of life, thinking about letters that we would write to our future self and imagining our future self reflecting back on this moment. And that's part of what Jeannie's going to help us think about today. So I'm going to invite Sydney to invite our special guest because they have a really special relationship. So Sydney, please tell us a little bit about what we're in store for.
Thanks so much, Yoshi, and we look forward to having Matt with us in a few moments. And Chag Urim Sameach. It's a time of, we may say, when Adar, Misha Nichnas Adar, so whoever enters or Adar enters our calendar, some joy increases. And so I know that we've talked in the past about, as the months have gone on, what we look forward to. And certainly some of the members of our community that are so dear to us, especially our elders, have begun to be vaccinated. And that's something that is bringing a lot of us joy. People being able to come outside or visit for the first time in a year, which seems pretty incredible. Yes, Yoshi, we are in for a treat. Dr. Jeannie Blaustein is a dear friend of mine, and I was first introduced to her through one of her creative projects, my dear friend Erin Davidman's play, which she executive produced and became a movie, Wrestling Jerusalem. And then another one of my dear friends, Dr. Jessica Zitter, Jeannie was the executive producer for her film. So she's an executive producer for 3 films. When I really got to be close with Jeannie is through the incredible work that she has done, not only as a licensed clinical psychologist and a pastoral counselor, but Jeannie is the founding board chair, co-creator of the Reimagine End of Life project and festival, which is a national nonprofit that is dedicated to hosting a public conversation about end of life and how death can really infuse our life with so much more meaning. And I had the great opportunity to present my one-woman show several times with Reimagine End of Life. And I'll just say, if you haven't visited the Reimagine End of Life website, Jeannie's passion for end of life and for care and support, it's really been brought to focus by that incredible holy and creative work that you've done. In San Francisco, I think there were like 300 events in 1 week. And in New York, there were 300 events, 350 events. I might be getting the numbers wrong, but it was
right.
Unbelievable how many events in 1 week where people came forward. And your inspiration really gave people so much to think about and created community. So I want to thank you for being here with us, sharing your creative gifts and also this comfort and what we make out of our own mortality and what we've gone through in this past year. And we're going to share a little bit about why you were so involved in creating Reimagine. And the first thing I want to do is ask you, because I didn't know you as the college graduate Jeannie, or as the teenager Jeannie. And rabbis get asked all the time. You know this because you were the president of B'nai Jeshurun in New York City. People always say, "Well, when did you know you wanted to be a rabbi?" So I'm wondering, since I didn't know you then, if you would share with us, if in college or after college, could you have imagined that you were going to be a part of this? And what were you like at that time? And where have you come from then?
Such a great question. Well, first of all, I want to say Chag Sameach to everybody. And thank you, Sydney and Yoshi and Matthew, for inviting me to share in this conversation with you. I'm really, really so happy to be here. Well, let's see. It's a funny question. And of course, the answer is no. When I graduated from college as a history major, it never occurred to me that I would be chairing the Reimagine end of life board, that I would have been a board president at my synagogue. But when I stop and think about it, I think, and this is probably true for so many of us, we can't predict, right? But if we go back and look, there's probably a plumb line. There's something that runs through all of that. And I think for me, this question started very, very early, which is, what is the official story that we tell each other and that we tell ourselves? And what is the actual lived reality that we live? So as a college student, as a history major, I wrote a senior thesis on the feminist retelling of psychoanalytic theory in the earliest days after Freud. So Freud wrote a whole theory of human sexuality based on men. And then the women came up and said, this doesn't exactly match my experience. And that really has been, that's my own story growing up in a family where there were secrets, particularly about end of life, and not so much secrets as much as, well, some secrets and some more just not talking about it, and other secrets. And, most families have things that are where there's a gap between how we want to think about ourselves and what the story actually is. And so I think for me, that has been kind of a running theme. And my PhD work in history, which I didn't complete, was in the same sort of genre. And so I think somehow being involved in helping people face the truths of their lives has always been an important thing to me, even as a college student.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm also wondering about this past year, if so many of the points in your life converged to the creation of this remarkable organization. And it was very prophetic that it started just a few years before COVID became a reality, and that we as a nation, we as a world have been staring at death, and death has been staring at us in such a different way in this past year. It has become so personal and so pervasive, so difficult. What do you think COVID has done to a new organization, a young organization like Reimagine? How has it altered it? And what do you see the direction that Reimagine is taking as a result of COVID?
So look, you said, what you said is so true, right? Obviously what's happened over the last year has literally brought death into our faces, onto our faces as we wear our masks, right? And into every corner of our lives, whether we're on the front lines or far back. It's all of us are living with a much, I think, more imminent experience of life and death. I don't think that there's ever been a time in any of our lifetimes where, with the exception of the AIDS epidemic, but even there, it was possible to kind of disassociate for some members of the community that this is not about me. COVID is different than that, even as it disproportionately affects people. So I think for Reimagine, what's happened is that, yes, we started 4 years ago, and we're really trying to get people to accept, crazy as it sounds, that death is real, right? And that death is coming, and that our lives that we can not only die better by preparing and thinking about what that process is and what our wishes are and talking to our loved ones and choosing healthcare agents, but also that life can be richer and that we can live more deeply in the face of that. Mary Oliver has that wonderful line, "What will you do with your one wild and precious life?" And I think what COVID has done is just bring that up so much more closely into our vision. And so it's also, I think, in doing that, has really helped people. I'll speak personally, but I know this is true for many folks at Reimagine also, has helped people think okay, so how do I want to live this life? What am I waiting for? So, I mean, in a very practical sense, Reimagine was built on festivals. As you said, we had hundreds of events across San Francisco and then across New York City at one time, something happening in Oakland while something else is happening in the Mission, and people are going to all these things in New York, Brooklyn, Staten Island, all over the place. 10,000 people showing up in these weeks. These are intimate, transformative, evocative experiences. We can't do any of that right now. So how do we do that? So like you all as rabbis, I could turn around this question to you. We've tried to recreate and literally reimagine how to have those kinds of kind of transformative experiential moments together online, virtually. And in fact, as I think has also happened in synagogue life, people are joining from literally all over the country, all over the world. So in a really weird way, it's we're no longer asking people to sort of try to imagine that death is out there. It's here. People are lonely, they're grieving, we're scared. Our lives, speaking of Purim, are turned upside down. And I think that there has been a deepening of a search for meaning. There's all these memes, right, about people baking bread, and like, yes, if you're baking tons of bread and people who really need flour can't get flour, I get it. But I think what people are looking for is some place to stand, right? Some way to anchor themselves. I know for me, dinner has become like really important. I want dinner. I want to make a good dinner. I want us to sit down at the table. It's my anchor. And when my family shared with me that there was a bit of tension about dinner, I realized, oh yeah, because it's my lifeline. It is what is anchoring me for months. And so I think we're all trying to find the ways that we can feel anchored. And that's, I think, a really important and hopeful thing, that we are finding opportunities for meaning in our lives.
I'll speak for myself and Yoshi and Matt. We're all waiting for you to make us dinner. We can't wait. So, it's,
Can I just tell you, I said we had a synagogue kind of gathering a couple days ago, and I said, I really am looking forward to making dinner and having people come over and hang out. And another friend said, I'm really looking forward to not making dinner and going out to dinner, which of course is also shut down. So, I'd be happy to make you guys dinner anytime.
At some point. As somebody who benefited so much from the Reimagine Festival, I'm wondering if you could, share an anecdote or a great story. And I'll just tell you that one of the things that that happened with COVID is, and I don't know if you heard this from the San Francisco group, but people started coming together, from all over the world, as we all have witnessed and we're experiencing right now. And there was a group that went from Reimagine, and there was a man who was about to die at the end of his life. And this group of people who never had met each other, they had attended a Reimagine event online, went through the end of his life with him. And then afterwards, they became Reimaginary friends. So that's what they call themselves, the Reimaginary friend. But this guy didn't have anybody else. And so when I think about these people who are now bound by Reimagine, bound by COVID, and bound by the first experience they've ever had of holding a space for somebody who was in the end of their life and doing it virtually, I just love that's such a profound space for people.
Well, this is a lot of what we do. So, I think another piece of what's happened this year is that the disproportionate effects of COVID on communities of color, for example, and then that sort of followed quickly by George Floyd's murder and the racial reckoning of the summer, has really, for example, given us, I think, even deeper incentive to work deeply into principles around justice and equity. And we've developed some guidelines for ourselves. We call them JEDI principles: justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And part of what we've done and are in the process of expanding are creating spaces for different communities to really talk about death and dying and living fully in the context of being in the African American community or in the Pacific Asian community or in the LGBTQ community. So what happens is that people do connect like that. And we often have breakout groups. And I've been in breakout groups. We've been having monthly COVID vigils on the 9th of each month to commemorate the first COVID death in Wuhan. And these breakout groups afterwards are, as you say, remarkable people from all over the place. and finding solace and connection. And some people become regulars and come back and come back, and we know them and love them, um, and have really found, I think, community in this time of isolation. And there are all kinds of stories from when we were meeting in person, like the guy who went to get a tattoo because it was 20 years after 9/11, and then he came to our 9/11 memorial, and basically had just gotten his diagnosis that he was cleared of cancer, that day. And so then there was just all these strangers, hundreds of strangers to celebrate with him. And those kinds of things are happening online too. And I would say that in COVID, everything is so heightened. And so when you connect with somebody who's grieving or who has just had a triumph in their life, and they just want to connect and feel alive, feel human, like it's beautiful. There's a lot of tears and a lot of virtual hugs happening.
Thank you. I wanted to, I'm a little nervous to do it this way, but I sort of feel like, given that it's Erev Purim, I should. And so I want to frame this question with a joke. And the joke is, it's one of my favorite rabbi jokes. It's a little dark, but again, Purim, everybody. So there's a rabbi, a cantor, and a synagogue president. And that's where you come in, Jeannie, because as Sid already mentioned, you're a past president of BJ in New York. And when I was a rabbinical student, I was a member at BJ for 2 years, and really loved being part of that community for the time that I lived in New York. But it's a joke about a rabbi, cantor, synagogue president, and they're on a deserted island. It turns out it's not deserted. They're captured by members of the indigenous people who live on this island. And they perceive the rabbi, the cantor, and the synagogue president as a threat. And they say, we're sorry, we're going to have to put you to death. And said, we're going to give you each one wish. So they say, Rabbi, what's your wish? Somehow they knew it was a rabbi. And she said, well, before I go, I want to share an assortment of some of my favorite High Holy Day sermons. It'll take a couple of hours, but I just would like to give them one last time. And then they turned to the cantor and they said, well, cantor, before you die, what's your wish? And the cantor said, well, the afternoon service on Yom Kippur is very, very powerful. I'd like to chant that through maybe a couple of times, just one last time before I die. And then they turn to the synagogue president, you know what's coming, Jeannie, and they say, and what's your wish? And the synagogue president said, kill me first. Thank you. I appreciate that. I know all of you out there are enjoying that. Now, why is that joke meant to be funny? Because who would want to be a synagogue president? You have to deal with so much tsuris, but I also know, having served synagogues for most of my career, that you get moments of incredible meaning and inspiration along the way. So notwithstanding the silliness of the joke and what it says about rabbis, what it says about cantors, and also what it says about synagogue presidents, what are some of the things that you learned in your role as a lay leader, taking on that really thankless task, although I'm sure you were appreciated deeply by Rabbi Saul and so many others in the community. But what are some lessons that you carried with you? Anything maybe surprising about that? And I'm also interested if there is a connection between that work and Reimagine and some of your thinking about these issues. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that experience.
Sure. Well, I will just say that I grew up in a Reform community in Baltimore, Temple Ohab Shalom, and it was not my favorite place to be. I fought with my rabbi all the way through confirmation class because I kept saying, why do you have to call it Jewish? Isn't this human? Just, human values. So when I started to get involved at BJ, my mom, who I think is on the call, was puzzled. It's like, from whence has this come? I spent a year in Israel, but somehow that didn't explain it. And basically, it all happened kind of strangely. I mean, I signed, and let this be a lesson to all of your congregants. I signed a spiritual pledge on Yom Kippur to visit the sick. And this was, I think, related to my general sense of like, I am not death literate. I am not illness literate. I need to get closer to this part of life so that I can teach my own children about this part of life. And so I signed up to, visit somebody. And the next thing I knew, my team leader, I was called, invited to join Bikur Holim, which is visiting the sick. And my team leader stepped down. So they asked me, like 2 weeks in, they asked me to do it. So then one of the co-chairs of the committee stepped down a couple months later. And so they asked me to do it. I remember my daughter at the time was little. And she said, "Mommy, you've been promoted." And I said, "This is how it works in a synagogue." And shortly after that, I joined the board. And a few years after that, they asked me to serve as the board president. So I know that a lot of folks, and many, folks I respect deeply, have said, I would not want to be in that role. I don't want to see the back side of this. I want to see my rabbis. I want to have my place to daven, to get comfort, community, etc. I have to say, for me, it was one of the most, if not the most, sort of enriching experiences of my life. And it was precisely because, yes, there is a lot to deal with. And actually, during my term, there was all kinds of service. And it was really, really, really challenging. But it was challenging in the context of a spiritual community. It was challenging in the context of a community that was really trying to serve, and to serve values that I believed in, that I believe in. And it was in the context of a community where caring for each other really mattered. And so when things went wrong, it wasn't just a sort of a cynical, how do we get out of this? It was like, oh my God, literally like, oh my God, what do we do? And so I felt like I got to see my rabbis as human beings, and to love them and honor them and learn from them and with them, and sometimes even offer up my own wisdom, that we were working very collaboratively together. And it was beautiful. And I was exhausted. I remember my kids reminded me of this. When I took the position, I said, "I just don't want this to affect my family life." And of course, I was president for 3 years, and then I was the chair for 3 years after that, which is kind of the emeritus role. And of course it affected my family life. It was like there was nothing else going on besides that role. But I really felt like having that opportunity to serve in that intimate way, and to support and hold the community, and to manage the differences. BJ is a big place, like the places that you guys all lead, and it's not a uniform community. People have very different positions on Israel and on interfaith marriage and all kinds of things. And I think one of the things I learned was, to really think about what it means to be a community, and how you honor those individual differences in the context of a larger community. And it kind of goes back to the thing I was talking about with Sid. Like, we have a story, right? Families have a story. We have a story about who we are, but we're much messier than that. So how do we honor the parts of ourselves that don't fit that story? How do we honor the members of our family who don't quite fit? It's like that. And a synagogue is a family. It's a big, complicated, messy family.
Well, I love when you were talking about the challenges of it all, and it made me think a little bit about John Lewis of blessed memory, when he talked about good trouble. And I was thinking about, good challenges. Like, there are challenges that we confront in our lives that are just unpleasant, and we might not even grow that much from, because it's just this difficult thing you have to go through. And yes, you're gonna grow through every experience, but it might not be the kind of growth that you're really looking for, and there might not be the sense of meaning and purpose. But leading a community, especially a community like you said, that's as diverse as BJ is, and that has all of the the opportunities that come your way, but the difficult moments too. And then there are things like right now, the president of my synagogue, I asked if she would take a third year. Normally it's a 2-year term. And I said, do one more year because we're working on a big project together. We're building a new early childhood center. And I said, do one more year and we can get to the next chapter of that development. It made a lot of sense leadership wise. Of course, she didn't know when she agreed to do it, nor did I, that it would be COVID-19 in this year. And so, suddenly a challenge that I'm sure a lot of folks would feel like, it's someone else's turn. Jeannie said yes so many times, but now it's someone else's turn. But I love the way it's shaped you, and I love that story too. So many rabbis I know and cantors I know were the ones who had those moments in religious school where they said, "Hey, wait a second, Rabbi, how come this or why not that?" And the next thing you know, you're the synagogue president, or you're in rabbinical school. I wanted to pivot a little bit to another part of your your work life. You've served as, and Sydney referenced it earlier, you've served as executive producer for some movies. And here I am in Los Angeles, not from here originally, but having spent now more than a decade in LA, I've really come to appreciate the creativity in this town. And so I'm just interested in the experience that you had in the film industry and some of the things that you learned. And maybe if you want, you could say a little bit about the movies themselves. But I'm really interested in, again, that connection between those experiences and perhaps Reimagine, or how it prepared you along your journey to the work that you're doing right now.
So I should say, so I've been involved with 3 films, as Sid mentioned. Wrestling Jerusalem, which grew out of Aaron David Mintz' beautiful, really Herculean one-man show about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And then another film about called Defining Hope, which was made by a beautiful photographer, filmmaker, Carolyn Jones, focusing on hospice nurses and their patients and the defining and the redefining of hope as things progress. And then a recent film with Jessica Zitter, also a physician in the Bay Area, called Caregiver, A Love Story, really looking at caregiver burden in the context of living with a dying partner. I have been very much in a I think of my role as sort of a backseat champion. I have not been in the intimate, scripting, although with Caregiver, A Love Story, I've played more of a sounding board kind of role. Really with Aaron, it was, his script and his play were intact, and I felt like a champion. And an advocate and a community builder. And in some ways, I think both my experience in the synagogue as the board president at BJ and these roles have sort of prepared me for the Reimagine role. Reimagine is the brainchild of my co-founder, Brad Wolf, who really had this idea of creating a sort of a festival model to talk about these issues. And so I think for me, I find myself, first of all, films are storytelling devices, right? That's what films are at their best. They tell important human stories. And each of these films has done that, which is what's drawn me to each of them. And I like to help people tell their stories. As a psychologist, that's what I've done. As a hospice person, volunteer in my early years in the end of life space, working as a chaplain at Mount Sinai, I help people bring to life their stories. And so these films do that. And then I'd like to help other people see them. I saw Aaron perform his tour de force show at the JCC in Manhattan. Rachel Cowan, may she be of blessed memory, had posted on Facebook, great show at the JCC, got to see it. So I was like, I'll do anything Rachel tells me to do. So I went. And on the way home, I said to my husband, everybody has to see this show. So I think one of the lessons, I think for me and maybe for others, is when you have that kind of feeling, like we have this sort of vision at Reimagine, call it, #why wait, right? Which is now more important than ever. Why? What are we waiting for? And I've had a few moments in my life where it's been like, why wait? Let's do this. Let's make this happen. And so being in a position financially, socially, whatever my resources are to help bring things to life that give people more to think about and that brings the truth up to the surface, that just gives me tremendous joy. And that's what Reimagine is. And the same thing happened. I heard about Reimagine on the radio, and I said to my husband, oh my God, a whole city's going to be talking about death. I got to go. I flew to San Francisco. I went into this first event. There were 400 people. Half of them were under 40. There was a disco ball and wine in the corner, and people were laughing and hugging and crying and talking about the meaning of life with a palliative care doc and a Silicon Valley, investor looking for the longevity gene. And I thought, oh my God. And I walked up to this guy. I had no idea who he was. And I said, this is incredible. I want to bring this to New York. So I think that role, and I think it was a role I had at BJ also, when you're the board president, you're not the front guy, right? The rabbis it's like a artistic organization, right? Like an opera, there's a creative director and there's a CEO. It's like the rabbis are the leaders, and you're kind of there supporting and holding and advocating and advancing. And I love that role. I love making things happen.
I love that through line, though, as I'm getting to know you in this conversation. I love seeing that through line of wanting to share. How do I make this possible for others to experience? And that's so beautiful when you find something meaningful in life, and then your first impulse is not how can I possess it, but rather how can I give this away? I love that. So whether it's with community in synagogue community, or whether it's in this meaningful experience, it's beautiful and it's inspiring, and I really appreciate it. Sid.
Yeah, I mean, I also love, you see how truly important rabbis are in the world, that we're the most important people. That's one of the things I just love about you. I mean, not many people know that, and most rabbis don't think that, of course. But speaking of which, look who's here from Shushan Purim. It's Rabbi Matt Gewirtz. And Matt, I'm gonna. Yoshi got to tell a really funny joke about President, Rabbi, and Cantor, and so I thought there's a joke that I've actually told in front of Jeannie at the opening of Reimagine. I wanted to share it because I think it's something that'll lead into this next topic, Jeannie, which is it's a interfaith panel that I was on. There was a rabbi, a minister, and a priest, and the moderator asked all three of us, "What would you like said about you at your funeral?" So when somebody is giving your eulogy, what do you want said about you? And the priest said, I just want people to say that I was dedicated to my flock and I believed completely in the word of God. And then the moderator said to the minister, what about you? And the minister said that I believe with all my heart in Jesus Christ and that I was a man of integrity. And then the moderator asked me, you, Rabbi, what would you like said about you at your funeral? And I said, look, she's still moving. So I bring up that joke, which is, kind of funny and not funny. And people always say like, well, do Jews believe in reincarnation? What about the afterlife and different things about different religions? But really, I wonder, touching on something that you said at the beginning about dinner, which is nobody could have anticipated what this year was like. And for many of us, it's been the most difficult year of our life. For some people, I hope for some people, there's been some joy. There's been good parts of learning about ourselves, really digging in deeply to our core, to our center, to our spiritual lives, and to the recognition that, yes, we all have a mortality that we are facing. And certainly for people who have been dying, either of COVID or not of COVID, but during COVID, I always say, I'm wondering some of the things that you've learned that you will bring into, I don't want to say the post-COVID world, because I think we're always going to be in the COVID world in some way in terms of our identity and how this year has impacted us. What are some of the things besides making dinner that you weren't doing before, not that you weren't making dinner before, but have become significant and important that you are going to prioritize and you've learned from this year?
So I don't know if it's so much about doing, but I think one of the things that I think we've all learned is that we are all vulnerable in ways that we don't like to think of ourselves, right? there's a vulnerability. There's a sense of needing other people. The families who were unable to be with loved ones as they were dying, the heartache of that. We see how important connection is, and I think at the same time, I think we've also seen incredible resilience and strength of people who are working on the front lines and who've managed to somehow stay the course through all of this. And for everyone whose lives have been disrupted, there's a Harvard team, Marty Linsky and Ron Heifetz, who talk about adaptation. And they talk about it in a sort of organizational sense, but really it's from a biological theory that if you don't adapt, you cannot survive as things change. And I think one of the things that we've seen is that we are finding ways to adapt to all of this. And so holding, I think, those two truths at once is something that I think is very important, that we really are vulnerable. We are not inert. We have feelings, we have reactions, and we have vulnerabilities. And we also have a certain amount of capacity to adapt. I also think that there's been a kind of refinement of balancing between the inner and the outer. As you said, for some people, this has been a time of tremendous stress and heartache and struggle. And for others, maybe, or maybe for all, there's also been an opportunity to grow in inwardly. At the same time, we're seeing so much suffering around us that I think the sense, and also, we've just come through this incredibly challenging political season, a sense of compassion and wanting to engage in the world. We're watching, our leaders sort of outperform each other in ineptitude in many cases. And so I think finding that balance between kind of cultivating our own garden and deepening our own sense of what matters, as I said before, and what's precious to us and how we're going to spend our time. But part of spending that time is not only about ourselves, right? It's about sort of showing up with presence and with compassion and with the power, whatever we have, whatever that looks like. Whether it's, we wrote thousands of postcards in our family and made thousands of texts and phone calls, during the election campaign season. And, other people are working in food pantries and showing up and donating. And I mean, I think there's just lots of ways to both hold, again, a sort of a paradox of the inner and the outer. So those are kind of two, how that translates into life for everybody, I think is different, but I think those two paradoxes are really important sort of learnings and things that have surfaced.
I want to follow up on that paradox, because I think that, that we are probably not okay in life to find balance until we're okay with the paradox. And you just mentioned, I think in many regards, the ultimate paradox. First of all, I'm glad to be here, and sorry I was a little bit late. I just talk about coming from paradox, just finished 2 or 3 different Purim spiels where we're trying to take the outside and make it in and the inside make it out. Typical rabbi takes 2 steps to get to the question. That was step 1. The second step is, I was watching 2 nights ago the president and vice president commemorate the 500,000 souls that have been lost. And and this is not a political statement at all. And it may be something that I'm just projecting, but one of the things that really moved me about it, and moves me about the president himself, is that because he's had 3 unbelievably tragic losses in his life, to lose a partner in life and then to lose 2 children at different points, you wonder how those people ever get up again. And not only does he get up, but when you hear the crack in his voice, that moment where he said, I've been with people as they slipped away, and I've missed the moment when they've slipped away. And it's sort of just, I have the chills in my back, because I have also, with both of my parents, I was there for one and not there for the other. And they both have such significant impacts, but the one consistent impact is vulnerability. And I will often say in the beginning of a funeral, there are two ways in life we make ourselves vulnerable. Either we make ourselves vulnerable, or life comes along and hits us like a truck when we don't expect it, nor do we invite it, and it makes us vulnerable anyway. And, the friend that we have in common, she and I used to have a conversation all the time. How is it possible? What practice can we utilize to make ourselves vulnerable without it having to come along with death? We know we can't help that. That's going to happen to all of us. But, and I'm not sure if it's even a fair question to ask, but have you come up with practice in your life to make ourselves vulnerable so it doesn't only happen when we experience loss?
It's such a great question. One thing I want to just say is that that experience of watching someone slip away is, there is nothing to do in that moment. You cannot stop that process, right? You can't cure the person, but there is presence, there is companionship, there is accompaniment, there is even healing, emotional healing that can happen. And I think that that is a metaphor for what we can practice in our lives, to your question. So there are many things that happen in life, and COVID is certainly one of them. No one saw this coming. No one invited it. It's horrible. It's been brutal on so many levels. And we are not in control. I'm thrilled that my 90-year-old mom just got her second vaccine. I mean, I'm so joyful about that. And that things may begin to open up, but we are confronted with so many parts of this epidemic, this pandemic, that we cannot control. And there are many other things in life that we can't control. Look at what just happened in Texas. Look at what happens on a much smaller scale. The school bus doesn't show up. Our schools can't figure out whether the kids can come or not. I mean, it happens all the time. So I think, the recovery community relies on the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change. God, grant me the serenity to accept things I cannot change. The courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And I think that that actually leads us to a very important set of practices. So for me, frankly, the end of life work started with my family because we had losses that we didn't talk about and all kinds of things. But it really started when I was saying goodbye to my kids at nighttime, saying goodnight. And I realized, this is like a little goodbye. This is like a little death. And I hate it. I hated saying goodnight to them because I realized there's going to come a time when I'm going to have to say goodbye. And I think noticing those transitional moments in our lives is a way of practicing. Some people practice through meditation, watching thoughts come and go and experiencing little deaths. There are little deaths all the time. We lose jobs, their losses, relationships change. Sometimes the weather just sucks and we can't control it and it messes up our plans. And my mother once wrote to her father. She was from Baltimore and she and her mother were in New York, and she wrote, "Dear Daddy, our plans for today were not like what we did." This is a kind of a grieving. And I think if we're open to it, we can practice the acceptance, not that we want death. It's excruciating. It's hard. We are changed. We're never the same when we lose somebody. My father died 30 years ago. I'm not the same. But I'm enriched by it. I know that life is short and poignant, and I have invested in, and I think we all can invest in finding these moments where we can work on the acceptance, which is not an embrace, but it's an acceptance of what is. Just like when we're sitting by with someone who's slipping away and we know we can't cure them, but we can be present and we can heal them and we can hold them and ourselves in that moment and in that love and in that sorrow, because there's sorrow.
That is so incredibly meaningful to me. I was thinking, because I never did this before, because I was one of those people that thought that anytime you talked about loss, you were going to hasten it. And, which I think is not so uncommon, so we hold our breath when we drive by the cemetery, or we punch, buggy blue, whatever, we have all these, what I've really tried to remove from my life, a Bubba Mice, a superstition, which we suppose gives us some kind of control, but we know actually is just making it further out of our control. So I started to read this years ago when I was in Manhattan, actually. And when I moved out here, I would take my eldest, who's now almost 17, through the reservation and watch the leaves in the fall, and said to him, look how sad it is that the leaves are disappearing. And just because leaves was such an innocuous way to deal with an initial loss. And leaves, of course, are much easier to say goodbye to than grandma would be eventually. And but then when he went to camp for the first time, my wife made such fun of me, because every day I'd walk past his room and I just had this deep, deep sadness. And she's like, honey, we have this whole month to ourselves. Come be sad with me. Come hang out with me, and I didn't know what was going on. And I realized that it was that initial goodbye. And that's just again, so poignant you put it that way. And this will be my last question, because I know the time is moving on. I wonder, and I feel like in some ways you might have just answered this, but with all this concentration on death and separation and loss, I've always believed that the concentration on death is really a hyper focus of concentration on life, as paradoxical as it sounds, which means that there needs to be hope there. What has all this work for you in your life done by way of giving you a greater sense of hope about humanity, the world, your spirituality, your Judaism, etc.?
Well, that expression, necessity is the mother of invention, right? And we have a Reimagine friend, one of our founding board members, Dr. B.J. Miller, who's a palliative care physician. And he says along those lines that death is the greatest constraint. And I think, exactly to your point, that invites actually a tremendous amount of creativity. That, we have this moment, and we actually get to, I think, to recognize the sort of the agency that we have, and to live life fully, to live by a why wait mentality is not necessarily to, might be a big bucket list, some grand gesture like moving to, I don't know, Paris or whatever, but it might be something that doesn't cost a penny. It might mean tapping into your vulnerability, tapping into, calling an old friend or a estranged person in your life. And, we have another founding board member from Reimagine, who's also a palliative care doctor, who's written a book called The Four Most Important Things. And these are things that, he sort of encourages people to say as death is approaching. But I think about this as part of the creativity of life. The four things are: I love you, I'm sorry, I forgive you, and thank you. What if we live like that all the time? All the time, in the checkout line: I forgive you. I'm sorry. I love you, checkout person. I love you, slow person in front of me who's got 18,000 pennies. Whatever it is, it's like we don't live from that place. And I think that we can. I think that death can inspire us to live from a place of our highest selves. And I think that's hopeful. I think that gives us the possibility of making every day count in sometimes the smallest ways. And I love that. People say, oh, how can you work in hospice? Isn't it so hard? And it's like the most hopeful thing because there's no artifice. There's no bullshit. It's like, we're here, man. This is it. How are we going to spend this time together? And it's like, let's be real. Let's be vulnerable. Let's get into it. And I think that's super exciting and super real. And it makes us feel human and connected. And I love that.
Beautiful.
Thank you
Love
so
that
much.
too. Wow.
Wow.
I love that too. That was amazing way for us to end on hope. It was a great question, Matthew. I love you. I'm sorry. Thank you. I forgive you. I just can't thank you enough, Jeannie, for being with us. And I don't know what I have to be sorry for, but or forgive you for. But I will say to you, I love you. And I will say that to you because just listen to a podcast on the difference between love you and I love you.
Yes.
And what I have noticed about myself this year, and I don't know if Matt and Yoshi have noticed this either, I really would hold my I love yous back from my congregants. I felt like there was some kind of intimacy that I love you meant too much. When I talk to congregants, I say I love you now all the time when I wasn't able to say it before this year for whatever reason. And I feel so freed by that because, as you said, what else can we be when we think about hope except loving and forgiving and being in a place of gratitude? And so I really appreciate that you brought us full circle to that, to a place of hope, because we all need it so much. And of course, I always want to thank my colleagues, Rabbi Matthew Gewirtz and Rabbi Yoshi Zweiback. And thanks, Yoshi, for putting our website, the Book of Life Project. Please sign up there for our next session on March 11th. Also, I put the Reimagine website. If you yourself are going through anything, and you are, whether you know it or not, everybody's going through something, sign up for some of the amazing Reimagine deep support that's going on this year. Finally, the next time that we meet is going to be on March 11th in 2 Thursdays. And we're going to be focused on how much we have had to confront the other and the enemy and the person we don't like this year. We are not always surrounded by people that we like or agree with. And this holiday of Purim focuses so much on Amalek, this evil force that keeps coming back, not only to poke at us, but to try and destroy us. And so in this moment in our country, how do we start creating some bridges with people we don't necessarily agree with and we wouldn't choose to be our friends, and frankly, we don't even like? How do we have those difficult conversations? And finally, we've been promising the last few sessions that I would teach VU breathing, and I'm going to do that in just a few minutes on March 11th, which is something about really helping our central nervous system that comes from the yogic tradition. So, Doctor, thank you so much. Rabbi.
Thank you. Thank
We'll
you
see
all.
on March
So
11th.
much. Thank you.
I love you too, Sydney. Thank you.
And Sydney, thank you for bringing Jeannie to us. I want to wish everybody a happy Purim. May you find a moment to be upside down a little bit and to laugh a little bit and just be silly, because that's important too. Thank you, everyone.
Hug Samach.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.